I'm just going to go over some quick ground rules before we get going. First is that I am going to go ahead and just, so that it's easier to hear the presenters without any feedback, I'm going to go ahead and mute all the participants here. When it comes time to break out into small discussion groups, or if you have a question to ask, you should be able to unmute just by pushing the little microphone icon on the bottom left of your screen, or if you're on the phone, I believe it's pound, pound 5.
Should be *6.
*6, okay. *6 if you're on a phone to unmute yourself. Thank you. With that said then, I want to also announce that Safe Streets is going to be holding another forum here. This one is going to be around preventing preventing drinking for underage community members. And this town hall is going to be held on December 16th from 6 to 7:30. It's also going to be through Zoom. If you're interested in attending that one as well, please feel free to send me an email, or you can send an email directly to Wanda Rochelle at wrochelle@safest.org. And we can put that information in the chat as well. We're also going to be recording this meeting tonight, this forum. So if you're not comfortable being on camera, please feel free to just turn your camera off, and that way you won't appear on the recording. Now, I think I have all our bases covered, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers for the night. We're going to be joined here tonight in our Anti-Racism for Neighbors forum. First, by Jahmad Canley from Potential Unleashed Consulting. And then we'll be hearing from Kasey Burton from the Housing Justice Project. So since we have a pretty packed schedule for tonight, I'll go ahead and turn it over then to Jahmad, who will get us started. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alberto, and good evening, everyone. It's so good to be here. I was really excited when Alberto reached out about this. Again, my name is Jahmad Canley. I'm the president of Potential Unleashed Consulting. We do a tremendous amount of work in this space, working with organizations, communities, schools, you name it, around anti-racism and equity work. But there's something special about working in your own community. I'm born and raised in Tacoma. I've lived in Tacoma my entire life, with the exception of the 4 years I spent in Pullman, Washington. And so, you know, Safe Streets, I remember seeing my first Safe Streets commercial with break dancers and my cousin, Charles Simmons, doing the rapping and singing in the video and everything. And so, you know, it's something that's near and dear to my heart. And so I really thank you all for your commitment and being here tonight. And again, just my wife did not grow up here. And so we were walking our dog one day. Our home is off of 90th and South K, and the street at the end of the block had a Safe Street sign. And, you know, explaining to her, you know, this was probably like 8-9 years ago, about Safe Streets and what it was. And, you know, and I thought it was, this kind of tells you about my naivety, because I didn't realize that not every city has Safe Streets. I thought it was this national thing that everyone had. And so when she was like, you know, never heard of it before, I was like, oh, okay, interesting. So I say all that to say thank you again for having me, and thank you for being here. Thank you also for chiming into the chat box and kind of letting me know a little bit about where people stay. I love being in community, and so being able to be here with you all tonight is important. Alberto, I was also stalling, but I forgot to tell you what I was stalling for. I need share privileges.
Yes, let me get that right to you.
Thank you so much. So tonight, you know, we have a lot of content. I'm going to be completely transparent and tell you that I was, as I mentioned, super excited. So I probably packed way more into this presentation that we will actually get to tonight. But I will make sure that you all get this through Alberto. I'll send this presentation so that it can be disseminated to all the participants, because I really want people to just be able to be engaged. our style of presenting is not lecture format. It's really about interaction, especially understanding that if you're going to talk about equity, equity needs to be embedded in everything you do, even how you present information. So with that said, I'll go ahead and get us started here, share my screen. Thank you so much, Alberto, for that. All right, Eric, I can see you on my screen. Can you give me a thumbs up if you're able to see that? Okay, thank you so much. All right, so I'm going to move through these first pieces pretty fast to get us into some of the other content. But anytime that we dive into conversations around racial justice, anti-racism work, racial equity, we like to start with what we call equity conversation agreements. And I'll move through these, but please feel free to stop me at any point and ask any questions that you have. And that's for anything in the presentation. The first one is move up and move back. And so what do I mean by that? As we go into this presentation tonight, you're going to have opportunities to be in smaller breakout rooms and have a little bit of conversation to unpack some of the things that we're talking about. And so while you're in those breakout rooms, we really invite people to move up and move back, meaning to take space and make space for other people. So let's say we put you in a breakout room with maybe 4 people and we give, 8 minutes or so for discussion time. It's about 2 minutes on average. If you recognize that maybe yourself and someone else has already spoken, but there's 2 people who haven't spoken and there's a few minutes left, it's a great opportunity to make space for them. But that also leads us into the next one, which is about making space for yourself as well. And we invite you to speak your truth. Everyone on this call has a different lived experience, and your lived experience is extremely important to this conversation. Sometimes people will say, well, I didn't grow up in a diverse community, and that's okay. That still adds a lot of value to this conversation because this is about all of us collectively together. The other piece that we mentioned about speaking your truth is we invite you to speak from I statements rather than making generalizations. So again, I statements, this has been my experience versus, well, this is how it is for all people all the time. The next one is to be open to other viewpoints. It's not a request for you to agree with all viewpoints, just to be open, because this is often how we learn and how we broaden our own perspectives is by learning from other people's experiences. The next one is experience discomfort. I won't go into my deep cognitive psychology background on this. Here's all I'll say is the brain is wired for comfort. So when we start feeling uncomfortable, it sends signals to us that say, shut down, stop, get out of this space as fast as possible. And I just want to invite you to be willing to experience discomfort. If we really think about it, most of us were raised that 3 things that you do not discuss in mixed company is race, religion, and politics. And so as we get into conversations around race and racism, sometimes you may feel some discomfort coming up. And one of the things that we know is that comfort often comes from experience. And so the more experience we have with the conversations, the more comfortable we will become. So if you do feel any discomfort coming up, I just invite you to pause for a moment and ask yourself, what truly is it about this conversation that's causing me to feel discomfort? And a lot of times we recognize it's just our lack of experience having these types of conversations around race and racism. All right, next one, expect and accept non-closure. Again, 60 minutes or 55 minutes or whatever we have left right now, 50 minutes isn't a lot of time. And so again, this is a journey, but we're starting it. And for some of us, we're continuing it tonight. Maintain confidentiality. Please take all the lessons out of Cure, but leave whoever shared the story, their identity in this space. Next one, consider intent and impact. We're going to get deeper into that in just a moment, but sometimes we say things with really great intent, but we don't always consider the impact. And we want to acknowledge both of those. And lastly, exercise learning courage, meaning, if there's a question that you have, feel free to shoot it to me in the chat box or to ask the question. That's what we hope people are able to do in this space, is to be able to ask questions about race and racism and how it plays out. And what do we need to do in order to become anti-racist or to create anti-racist communities? Right now in Tacoma, we're helping lead a charge right now around Tacoma and Pierce County around what does it look like to create an anti-racist community? I think that this community has a wonderful opportunity to do exactly that because we have a different level of connectivity, big enough yet small enough in this community of Tacoma and Pierce County that we can actually do some amazing things. So we'll talk more about that here. All right, any questions on any of those? No, okay, Alberto, if you wouldn't mind just getting the breakout room set up for a moment, we can do like groups of 4 for this next activity that I'm gonna do here. All right, and the prompt is this: discussing race and racism and anti-racism with my peers tonight or today feels like what? And let me break down what we mean by that. When we say today, we're not just talking about Tuesday, December 8th, right? Today, the 8th? Yeah, Tuesday, December 8th. What we're really talking about is Tuesday, December 8th, 2020, right? And let's just talk about 2020. We're talking about 2020 amidst a global pandemic. We're talking about December 8th, coming on the heels of this election, which is still not done in some places. We're talking about 2020, the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Manny Ellis, and many others. All right, Walter Wallace Jr., so on and so forth. We're talking about 2020 after, in some places, they're still continuing protests, uprisings, right? So when you think about all those things in context, discussing race, racism, anti-racism today feels like what? So 1, standing on the edge of a cliff looking into the abyss. 2, running a marathon. 3, walking into a hornet's nest. Or 4, drinking a tall glass of water on a hot summer's day. So let me break this down for everyone really fast. These are wide open for your own interpretation. No judgment on any of these. For example, one person will pick standing on the edge of a cliff because it represents one thing to them, and it will represent something completely different for the next person. And that's why we're going to go into breakout rooms and give you opportunity to discuss which one would you pick and why would you pick that one? What does it represent for you? And then we'll come back together as a large collective group and kind of walk through each one of these and have one person share out from each one of these groups. So someone who chose standing on the edge of a cliff will ask you to share why you chose it. Someone who chose running a marathon, walking into a hornet's nest, and drinking a tall glass of water, if we have representatives from each floor. Okay. Any questions on that or on the prompt? And I'll leave this up for a moment. I'll also post this in the chat box here, but leave it up for a moment for you to think about. And then I'll post it into the chat box. And Alberto, as soon as you see it in the chat box, if you want to go ahead and open up the breakout rooms, that would be great.
Are we the room?
Yeah, I think we're in the room.
I
think so.
All right.
Can we see the slide that he put up?
I don't see them. No.
Okay.
Well, I think, let me message Alberto. I think he was going to post the message in the comments, and I think in the chat, but I think maybe we got split off just a second too soon before it was actually there. Let me reach out to Alberto really quick just to see if he can do a message to everybody with that information.
Okay.
Well, while we're waiting for that, does anybody remember kind of what the options were and want to give what your answer was?
Sure. As I remember, the options were that talking about racism feels like looking over a cliff into the abyss, running a marathon, walking into a hornet's nest, or drinking a cool glass of water. And for me, it's running a marathon because we've got a long way to go. But it's, there's no quitting.
I agree. I was thinking it was like a marathon because there's so many issues going on right now that to discuss them all, it's almost impossible, like a marathon is to me.
Did anyone
I
have a
think-
different answer that they wanted to share?
I feel like it's standing on a cliff staring into the into the abyss. Like I feel just when I start looking at 2020 and just like the systemic parts of racism, I feel like it's like never going to get better. And it makes me feel really hopeless.
Well, thank you for sharing. I was thinking of it like a marathon, but in the sense that it's an old topic that just keeps going. And I'm hopeful that there's in a sense a finish line, and it would be to dig through that systemic through all the institutions and whatnot, and where it is everywhere. But yeah, that thinking generations past, my parents have had the conversation, and I want to believe that their parents and their parents and their parents have also at least had the conversation. I don't know what their views were, but that here I am today still having that conversation. And Justin's here as well. Did you?
Yeah, and I think I agree on the terms of a marathon, in that it's so far off. And I mean, I'm not a person who run a marathon, but just thinking of the 20, the 26 miles, and there's somewhere in there where you're just beaten down, and it's more apparent that you've got a long ways to go. And I feel that's kind of where we're at when it comes to it. And I can even see it on the edge of being like on the cliff and looking at it, because the more you educate yourself, the more you see how deep things really go. And it's not just so simple as to say, hey, let's just change this, because you have to change entire systems. And that can seem super daunting.
Yeah, I think for me, it's kind of between the abyss, the cliff and abyss analogy, and the marathon, and that it's with the abyss analogy, I agree with the fact that it's very daunting to try to talk about this kind of, talk about these topics, do this work, try to educate yourself around what's going on. And then to try to figure out what it is that you can actually do about it. It really does seem like you can visualize where the end is, but it's really hard to recognize how to get there. And that you can kind of have an idea about what the sort of landmarks in the marathon are to try to reach that end goal. But kind of like what everyone's saying, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, and we're already kind of in it. I think that we've been working on things that have been continued from past generations, but it is really daunting and intimidating to try to figure out how to get there all the way. And it looks like we are being called back to the breakout room. Did anybody else have anything they'd like to say in the last 30 seconds? Okay, I'll see you all back in there.
Let's give a couple more moments for everyone to make their way back to the main room.
No, here you have the.
Keep going.
Okay.
All right, everyone is back. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you again for your engagement in the breakout rooms. We're going to move through the questions that we were discussing in our breakout rooms. And so, again, discussing race, racism, and being anti-racist today feels like what? So let's hear from a representative who chose standing on the edge of a cliff looking to the abyss. Who chose that? And please tell us why you chose that one.
Hey,
Yes,
this is, hello?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Shar, and yeah, I took the standing on the edge of the cliff. It's just because, you know, it's like you can have a group of people and you're out looking at what you're seeing off the cliff there, and nobody's seeing the same thing, you know, although it's the kind of like the same view, you know, and it's like some people, you know, you start discussing things and it's like people are just totally unaware of what you're experiencing at this view.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah. I'm also going to move to, I'll tell you some of the other things that we normally hear about that one when we wrap up all four. So someone who chose running a marathon, please tell us why you chose that one.
I can go for that one. My name is Gina Cabadoo, and of the 3 of the 4 people that could share, we all chose the running the marathon, which I thought was interesting. Some of the things that we heard was that there's some lifelong issues of family members or friends not seeing things the same way as you do. Also that this is a long haul. It's a choice that you make every day to do this work, and it requires training and conditioning. And then also that this is a mixture of things, given some background in some public health.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Let's go to Hornet's Nest. Anyone choose a Hornet's Nest? And if so, why did you choose that one? Sue, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Patrick, and then Sue, I'll come right back to you.
We were just talking about different perspectives and how I grew up learning about race and related issues in a different time.
Yeah,
I'm 68 years old. And so there's a lot of experience that I've had that a lot of younger people haven't had and probably never will. And so what ends up happening is my viewpoint on things is shaped by a different set of information than perhaps, as I was saying, my son-in-law, who's a 40-year-old Black man, he sees things differently.
Yeah.
And, you know, it hasn't been serious conflict, but there's been some.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, thank you. Thank you for that, Patrick. Yeah. You know, I was speaking with someone about that very same thing the other day, and they were just saying exactly the same thing, that, you know, based off of how long you've been on this planet, you can even perceive this whole conversation much differently, because some people, I was speaking with someone, she was a 75-year-old African-American woman, and she said, you know, growing up, when I grew up, we've made a lot of progress. We haven't made enough, but we made a lot of progress. But her granddaughter, who is 21 years old, is like, we haven't made any progress. You know what I mean? And so it's a really interesting conversation, I think, and it takes all the above. So thank you for that. Sue, I wanted to come back to you because you had your hand raised. I think you were probably going to talk about running the marathon.
It was actually just clapping my hands. It wasn't the hand raised, but that's okay. I don't mind sharing. I think I had the same thing, though, to say that, oh, I can't see whose name it was now, whomever it was that last spoke about, oh, I think it was Gina. Yes. Yeah, pretty much echoing what she had to say. Sorry, my reactions might have been wrong.
No, not at all. And I just saw it out at the corner of my eye, so no worries. All right, that leads us to the last corner, which was drinking a tall glass of water on a hot summer's day. Anyone choose that one? Yeah, Caitlin, I believe it's pronounced Caitlin. Would you mind sharing?
Thanks, Jahmad. Yeah, I really identified with all 4 of them, but I chose this one because I work at Safe Streets, and work in the nonprofit sector. And it feels like, especially in our industry, these conversations are really being integrated into all the work that is happening everywhere. And it feels like people are finally really starting to feel comfortable saying things that sharing their experience and saying things that have been on their mind for a really long time. And it's really refreshing to have that kind of openness starting to happen.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you all again for taking the time to share. You know, if we had more time, I would definitely have more voices even engage in this. That's why we use the smaller breakout rooms. But I really appreciate all the different perspectives. Again, often what we hear is that people could have chosen more than one corner. How many of you would agree with that? Yeah, right. That goes, for me, depending on the day, depending on the group that I'm with, I could choose different corners, right? All the time. The edge of the cliff, as it was stated earlier, we hear that people sometimes view that as like, it can feel overwhelming. It could feel vast, right? Some people see it though, as like the jumping off point. And so there's excitement, like we're finally about to do this. Some people have mentioned that, if you've ever propelled down the side of a cliff, that it's stepping over the cliff that gets like all the anxiety. But once you do, it's really easy. The running a marathon, lots of things that we heard in this. Sometimes, one, that it's not a sprint, that it's a long journey, it's a long haul, and that sometimes you're running with a large group of people and sometimes you're by yourself. Sometimes you're trying to figure out, can I continue? Can I make it? And you need to refresh. You need that, cup of water. You need whatever it is, right? You need to take a breath. So, that's often what the marathon represents. And then also people will say that you don't just run a marathon, but you need to do some training, right? You got to get prepared for that. Walking into the hornet's nest, again, sometimes people see that and they perceive it as fear. But what I hear from a lot of people is that they don't see it as something that you should be afraid of, but they recognize that it could be potential conflict and that you need to approach it with caution, right? And then drinking a tall glass of water, like Caitlin said, a lot of people will perceive that as it's refreshing. It's not always easy, but once you get into it, it's refreshing and it's time that it's needed, right? That it's needed. So thank you all again for sharing your thoughts on that and really being transparent about where we are and the recognition that, again, each one of us probably could have chosen more than one corner on all of those things. So thank you. I want to move to this are called Both And Lenses, and I'm going to blaze through this super fast, but again, you will have this PowerPoint. Both And lenses are something that we use when we're engaged in these conversations, specifically around racial equity, because mindsets often move towards either or thinking. And either or thinking we find does not serve us well when it comes to these conversations around equity. And so we have built and designed these both and lenses. The first one is intent and impact. So again, it's looking at both and. A lot of times people are willing to own their intent, but we also want people to consider the impact. Right. And this is so important, especially when we talk about community and community design. Sometimes we can do things with really great intent and then not realize the full impact. An example of this in our own state was almost 2 years ago when the state legislature decided how they were going to fund education. And they decided to fund education based off of cost of living, which therefore meant districts like Bellevue, for example, would receive more funding than a district like Tacoma or Yakima, right? Once they looked at the actual impact of that, they said, oh, we didn't think about that. And they went back and they reworked it. So again, intent and impact. It's important that when we talk about equity that we're considering both. The next one is difference and sameness. And this is an important one. So we are going to spend some time with this. They're all important, but we're going to spend some time on this one. We know that being hyper-focused on difference leads to separation. Every ism you can think of, racism, sexism, is hyper-focused on difference. And we believe difference is beautiful, difference is diversity, but when we become hyper-focused on it, people can use it to separate us. So a lot of people then lean to being hyper-focused on sameness. And again, we believe that as human beings, we have more in common than we have apart, but we also recognize that there's danger in being hyper-focused on sameness. And here's what it often sounds like. I don't see color, or I'm colorblind. Right. And there's danger in that, because when you don't see all of a person's identity, you don't see that they actually walk through this world differently. My wife, for example, on paper, we look very similar, but I recognize simply based off of our gender, we have different lived experiences. There are things that she experiences that I have never experienced. For example, when we went to go buy a car, as long as we were walking around and talking about buying a car and test driving, the salesperson spoke to both of us. The moment that we sat down to talk about the finances, my wife became invisible. Mm-hmm. I have female consultants on my team who go through the same similar thing, right? That they might be the lead person on a project, but people often look to, if they have a male teammate, they look to the male teammate. And so there is difference, and there's difference based off of race, right? That again, people experience this world differently. based off of those factors. And so we understand the importance of looking at both, right? So recognizing difference, recognizing sameness, but understanding that there's danger if we become too hyper-focused on either one of those. Let's talk briefly about where this comes from. Back in the 60s, a very, very important person to our history by the name of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. made a speech, "I have a dream." Many people are familiar with it. You can even quote it. And he said, "I have a dream that one day," I'm paraphrasing, "my children would not be judged based off of the color of their skin, but based off of the content of their character." And a lot of people heard that and agreed with that and said, we want to do that. And they thought the solution was to be colorblind or to no longer see color. But that's not what he said. He said, let's not judge based off of color. Because again, when we don't see color, we can actually create harm and cause harm. Right. Next one is individual and group. Individual and group is really looking at it like this. Each person on this call is an individual, and we also have group identities. And especially when we talk about race. So this is really important. Sometimes it's important to recognize that sometimes people aren't speaking to me as an individual, they're speaking to my group identity. Sometimes people will push back on this. They'll say, Jahmad, I hate the phrase white person. I'll say, why? They'll say, well, I don't identify as a white person. How do you identify? And they'll say, I identify as Mike. Got it. So they identify as an individual. Here's what I also want us to recognize is that often historically marginalized groups don't have the option to identify as only individuals. People see their group identity and judge them by their group identity long before they ever get to know them as an individual. Right? So it's a both and. Next one is whole and part. I love the fact that we're doing this work holistically as a community right now with Safe Streets and recognizing that each one of us has our part to play. This next one is called Responsible, Not My Fault. Simply put, it's the recognition that none of us were alive in 1492 or 1619. And so the fact that slavery and the genocide of indigenous people was created in North America is not our fault. Why is that so important? One of the things that we find that keeps people from engaging in this conversation is when this conversation is led through the lens of blame and shame. It's not our fault that those systems were created. And very important, we have a responsibility. Once we recognize that there are historic systems of oppression that still live today, we have a responsibility to do what we can to dismantle those systems. Right? To look at systemic racism and figure out how can we make sure we're not perpetuating those. So it's responsible and not my fault. Not my fault for the past, but responsible for the present and future. Next one is self-reflection and action. If we run to action without self-reflection, dangerous, because we end up doing things that end us in the intent and impact box, but also sitting in self-reflection without taking action is equally dangerous as well, because people's lives and their life outcomes are being impacted every day. I love what Gina mentioned earlier about this being tied in with health as well. We do a lot of work with that and looking at health inequities. And so when you recognize that racism actually is a public health issue as well, and that it impacts people's lives on so many different levels, the fact that we have a disproportionate number of Black and brown people who are being impacted by COVID is not genetics. Okay, let me just put that out there. It's not like the virus is more attracted to Black and brown people. It is based off of historical inequities. If you only take public transportation because financially you can't afford your own transportation, well, then you were more susceptible to getting the virus, right? And so on and so forth. If you have lived on the outskirts and the margins and had less access to health and proper health, again, so you came in with pre-existing conditions, so on and so forth, right? So again, we can't just sit in self-reflection because people's lives are being impacted every day. All right, next one, challenge and support. This is really about, again, doing both of these. Right now we have what's called a cancel culture. And so some people go, whoa, 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 I don't want to be challenged. If I had more time, I would talk to us about how we can challenge and how we also can accept the challenge and see it as a gift. Because most people will just mentally write you off. So when someone actually calls you on something, for example, mispronouncing someone's name or making a statement that you haven't considered both the intent and impact, see it as a gift, because they're actually calling you in so that you don't continue to do harm to other people, because the belief is that you have positive intent, but you may not know the impact. And then lastly, valued and flawed. Sometimes people get really sensitive when we begin having conversations, especially around the historic lens of racism in the US. You can recognize that historically, when it comes to race, we have a lot of flaws in the US. And that does not mean that you don't value the United States as well. You can do both. That also goes for individuals. So that's just a side note. There may be people in your life who you love, who have extreme value for you in your life. And you can recognize that when it comes to this conversation around race and racism, they have some flawed views. So you can do both, okay? So those are the both and lenses. I wanna give you that, and I put that in here because it's a skill set for future conversations that you can use outside of this work that we're doing tonight. Sound good? All right, I know I'm moving really fast to that stuff because I want to get us into these next pieces. So why race? This is where I really want to spend some time. This image that you're looking at right now is what we call a diversity wheel. So you see lots of different things in this wheel. And people often will say, why are we talking about race when we could be talking about gender, and we could be talking about class, and we could be talking about, you know, physical abilities, and we could be talking about sexual orientation. And all of those things are extremely important. And the reason why we center these conversations around race is because race impacts every single one of those categories. If we were to even look at, for example, one of my friends who was transgender, we were having a conversation and he said, you know, why are we talking about race? We should be talking about identity, and we should be talking about these other pieces, and we should be talking about, you know, gender. And I said, you're absolutely right. And I want you to consider this. When you think about your friends and the people in the trans community who have been actually murdered because of their identity, what do most of them look like? Discrimination is happening across the spectrum, but again, and he looked at me, he said, you're absolutely right. Most of them are people of color. Yeah, that's why. So again, that's why we're starting with race. So let's keep going with that. Why else are we talking about race? Again, I mentioned earlier, it impacts everything. This is just out of the school system. Black boys are 3 times more likely to be suspended than white boys. Black girls are 6 times more to be suspended than white girls. This isn't only about black and white, so just know that, but these are just some of the stats and data. But here's what I want everyone stopping and asking tonight, because you probably have heard some of these stats and some of this data. The question I want you asking and answering is why? See, we hear these stats all the time, we go, oh, that's horrible. But we need to ask and answer the question, why? Is it because we believe that Black children are just worse behaving than white children? We're only going to come up with 2 answers. Either 1, that's our belief, or 2, we recognize that there's something systemic at play here. Let's keep moving though. This looks at, again, so we're just looking at the different pieces. This looks at homelessness of LGBTQ youth. So again, going back to that list, why race? Because even when we look at LGBTQ youth and homeless rates, you will find that based off of race, again, Black youth, though they make up a smaller percentage of all youth in the US, again, have a higher homeless rate and also confined youth, right? Again, why? This is homes that have food insecurities. Does it impact everyone? Absolutely. But again, you can see disparities based off of race. Incarceration, remember this. Out of this list, Black people make up the smallest percentage of population. Next would be our Latinx, and then white people make up the largest percentage of the population, but you see this is completely inverted. So again, we must ask and answer the question, why? Is it because we believe that Black and brown people are just inherently, genetically more, you know, have the propensity to commit crimes? Is that what we believe? Or is there something else at play here, right? Last one, this is from Tacoma Pierce County Health Department. This found that African-American women have the least amount of opportunity for their children to survive the first year of birth. So this is highlighting this study, and it says that Black women, again, have children that are born at lower birth rates, therefore increasing the mortality rate of infants within their first year. This is Black women who have never smoked, who are healthy, who have education and come from higher socioeconomic status, have a least likelihood chance of their child surviving the first year of birth than a white woman who has smoked, who did not graduate from high school, who comes from a lower socioeconomic status. And then they wanted to go deeper. Was this a genetic thing? And so they looked at this and said, let's look at Black women versus African-born women. And they found that the same thing did not line up. that again, African-American women, women who were born in the United States, that they had a greater likelihood that their children would not survive the first year than African women who had, immigrated here. Why is that important? Because they said the only link that they could find is the impact of racism and the stress that it causes on women and babies. So that's why we're talking about race. So let's go deeper. Where did the concept of race even come from? So please come off of mute if you would like. Anyone care to share what you know about this? Where did the concept of race come from? And you don't have to have the right answer, right? Meaning you don't have to have the dictionary definition or anything like that. We're just talking about, what have you heard about this?
Slavery.
Slavery? Yeah. Thank you. Roxanne, is that how you pronounce that?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Roxanne. Yeah. So slavery, definitely one of those pieces.
It's a man-made construct for power differentials.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's tie those two things together, right? There were a lot of different things that happen around this idea of race. By the way, race has not always been with us. As a matter of fact, if you look at any of the holy books, so the Bible, the Torah, the Quran, you will not see or hear about race. People are identified by their geographical region or by their culture or by their religion. So a Jew was a Jew, a Greek was a Greek, an Ethiopian was an Ethiopian. Race did not come around until like the 1600s, right? And people were trying to figure this thing out. Some of it was innocent intent. So one of the people was a botanist who studied plants and species and said, since there's so many different species of plants, surely there must be different species of human beings. Did a study and said, nope, genetically, we're basically the same. But then later on, other people came around and said, well, nah, because they wanted to justify superiority and inferiority. And so you may be familiar with one of the studies. It's called the cranium study or the skull study, where a person then looked and tried to study these skulls. And based off of the size of the skull, then said this actually determines the superiority of these races. So if you ever wondered why white people historically have been referred to as Caucasian, it is because the skull that was used to identify Caucasian or white people was found near the Caucasus Mountains. And that's where the term Caucasian comes from. Now, that study is flawed on so many levels. My head is probably twice the size of my wife, and I can tell you she is far more intelligent and superior to me. But this caught fire in so many places. And as it was mentioned by Roxanne, it caught fire in North America. Why? Because people needed to justify slavery. And so they brought this person from Europe to the US and actually put them on a tour to share their theory and their quote unquote research so that it could help people feel better about the enslavement of other people. We'll talk more about that in a moment. How race impacts. So one, race is a made up social construct. Race designations have changed over time. Why? Because it's a made up social construct, man-made. So some groups that are considered white in the United States today were considered non-white in previous eras. Why? Because it's a made up social construct. So you can change it anytime that you want, right? You see down here that Asian American Pacific Islanders, their designation changed 4 times alone in 1 century. Because it's all about who's in control, and you can change these racial designations. So again, Irish, Italian, Jewish people at one point in time were not considered to be white in the US, but that has changed over time as it's a made up social construct. Other definitions on this. So race, a social construct, which we just talked about. Racism is the belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. And here's the main piece I really want us to understand tonight. Racism is a system. It's a system. It is not just an individual character flaw, nor a personal moral failing, nor a psychiatric illness. It is a system consisting of structures, policies, practices, and norms. Again, you'll get this presentation, so no need to try to write down any of the definitions. But let's break this down a little bit further. Racism as a definition. Race and ism, which means system, very important. Anytime that you see those 3 letters, ISM, it means system. So it's not only prejudice and discrimination based on race, as many of us were taught and raised, that prejudice was just discrimination based on race. It also includes a system of power. What are we talking about? policies, procedures, laws, all put in place to advantage some and disadvantage others. That's the system of power, right? And it's not a system of power based off of regional pockets, because sometimes people say, well, here in the Northwest, I don't think we have racism. It doesn't work like that. And by the way, we do. So let's just get that out there. The other reason why this is so important, a lot of us were raised with this idea, this concept that reverse racism also takes place. There's no such thing as reverse racism. Is there discrimination? Yeah, we can discriminate all different types of ways. I, Jahmad Canley, can discriminate against Sue Garcia. Absolutely. She could even go to the Office of Civil Rights and say, Jahmad Canley is discriminating against me because I'm a white woman, just going by your pronouns, right? Would it be considered reverse racism? No, because it does not include the larger system of power of the United States that we're talking about, okay? So important. Here's one of my favorite quotes. Race is the child of racism, not the father. Let's process that for a moment. What Mr. Coates is saying here is that the only reason why we even have this idea of race is because someone was trying to actually justify racism. And so they needed to create this social construct called race in order to justify their racist thoughts and beliefs. Very important. All right, so what does racism look like, folks? We were raised that racism looked like this. Individuals carrying Confederate flags, wearing sheets, burning crosses. And that's a part of it. So if we look at these really fast, the top is where most of us have been conditioned that this is what racism looks like. We really don't even talk about the top left, internalized racism. We were raised that racism looks like the top right quadrant, interpersonal racism. What does that look like? Racial slurs, bigotry, hate crimes, racial violence. We watched videos on it. We knew what it looked like. And this is why so many people, I believe, have been shocked in 2020 when they realized that we haven't come as far as we thought we had. Because when your focus is on interpersonal racism, you think, well, as a country, we're doing really well. Because the truth is, research says prior to the election of President Barack Obama, interpersonal racism was actually on a decline in the United States. It was actually declining. All the while it was declining, systemic level racism was increasing. Let me give you some examples of systemic level racism. Mass incarceration of Black and brown people continue to increase. Discipline between Black students and white students continue to increase. Wealth gaps between white families, Black families, and Latinx families continue to increase. They say right now it would take Latinx, Hispanic families about 77 years to close the wealth gap. It would take African Americans about 222 years, almost the exact time that Black people were enslaved. It would take almost the exact time to close the wealth gap. And other systemic levels of racism continue to increase, all during the time that interpersonal racism was declining. This, my people, is where, if we really want to do something to really impact how racism operates in our communities, we must look beyond just the interpersonal level and really look at the systemic level. What are the policies, practices, procedures that are in place? What does structural racism look like? Again, they give some examples here that are going to be really important for the next couple of minutes of our conversation. So an example is the overwhelming number of depictions of people of color as criminals in mainstream media, which can influence how various institutions and individuals treat people of color with suspicion when they are shopping, traveling, or seeking housing and employment, right? Here's one of the things that I wanted us to talk about tonight. I've done a lot of work with community organizations, and one of the things that comes up is safety. And we don't always recognize how systemic level racism and structural racism even blurs our idea of what safety looks like. So on one hand, we're attempting to keep our neighborhoods safe, and we don't always talk about it, but based off of the fact that we're all being conditioned by the media, by movies, by things that we read, safety sometimes has a color to it. Safety sometimes looks one way. And when we see someone who doesn't look like they belong in our neighborhood, they end up dead. Trayvon Martin, suspicious in this neighborhood. I'm out patrolling to keep my neighborhood safe. And this person looks like they might be here to do something wrong. We all knew about that, but this happens in our communities every single day. Intent, positive, keep our community safe. But if we don't recognize how structural and systemic level racism is impacting all of us, and we don't examine those things, we have unwritten policies that say, if you see a group of Black or brown teens walking through the neighborhood, they're probably up to no good, and therefore we should call the cops, right? This is where the conversation needs to get to. Now, I guarantee that the person who calls the cops would never consider themselves a racist. They're just trying to keep their community safe. So again, this is why this is such an important conversation that you're having. Other pieces, every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. Why are we talking about that? The way that our communities function is not by accident. If I had more time, I would go into redlining and the history of redlining and how communities were designed. Like the fact that when my grandparents moved here, both of them, my mom's parents from Tennessee, my dad's parents from Arkansas, the only place that they could buy homes was on the east side of Tacoma. How that still has an impact today on all these other things that we're talking about. The fact that if you go to like the east side of Tacoma down by Shalishan and Lister, where are the grocery stores? How does that impact one's health? Right? And so on and so forth, that the only place that you can eat is at the corner store. What does that do? Where are the restaurants? Right? Those things, again, community design, it's not by accident. Every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. And so here's my last couple pieces that I'll close with. It's important that we understand that every historical institution in the United States, and I'm going to say this really slow, every historical institution in the United States has a load-bearing wall of white supremacy. I'm going to say it again because it's a load. Every historical institution in the United States has a load-bearing wall of white supremacy. What's a load-bearing wall? It's structured. You can paint it, you can decorate it, but you can't just blow it out. It's the structure that holds it together. Remember the lens, responsible, not my fault. Because sometimes when I make that statement, people go, whoa, that doesn't feel good. Valued and flawed, responsible, not my fault. We must remember that when these institutions were created, they were created during a time that we still had legalized slavery. So what are some of those historical institutions? Banking, housing, education, law enforcement, legal systems, government. When they were created in the United States, slavery was still legal. That's why the Dred Scott Supreme Court case is so important, because that's an example of the system, the highest court in the land, saying, sorry, you need to be returned to your quote unquote owners. Even though you're in a free state, you must be returned to your quote unquote owners because that is the law. Slavery was a law. And we didn't abolish slavery until when? Does anyone know what year we abolished it?
1865. 1865.
Thank you so much. 1865, right? 13th Amendment. I saw you, Sue. Sue's like, we're still waiting here. And that's a really important question, because the 13th Amendment says slavery is abolished with one exception, and that is being duly convicted of a crime. So I'm going to put this out here for you to chew on tonight, and that is, did the 13th Amendment abolish slavery or did it legalize slavery? Because instantly, once you create the 13th Amendment, you put a clause in it that says slavery is abolished with the exception of being duly convicted of a crime. And then you instantly introduce Jim Crow laws, and we see the beginning of mass incarceration. Why? Racism has an undercurrent of economics. And the US was thriving at this time because of free labor. And what happens if all of a sudden you abolish slavery? What happens to the US economy? You got it, it tanks. So at the same time that we abolished slavery, we also legalized it. We just said it's illegal for individuals to own other people, but the government, through mass incarceration, could still do so. All right, let me go with this last slide real fast. So these are some of the different systems that we talked about right here already. And this is where I want to end. So what is our solution? The solution is becoming anti-racist. And so how do we do that? It's so important that we become anti-racist and that we're intentional about this. Kendi's book and others, Angela Davis and others, because anti-racism is not a new concept, by the way. It's been around since the 60s. And what they state in this is that because of the way that the systems were designed, by doing nothing, we actually are not helping move in another direction because the systems will continue. So it says the opposite of racist is not racist, right? We must actually be intentionally anti-racist. So what does that mean? If you look down here, anti-racist is one who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. Here's a better idea of it. It means it gives up privilege and is okay with it. And I love this. There is no neutral. So if we are not intentionally doing things to move towards anti-racism, again, we are allowing racism to continue to function as the status quo. And this, I was sharing with Alberto, we just became landlords, my wife and I was amazed. I've been doing this work for 12 years. I was amazed at how much bias and racism plays out in housing still to this day. Because we joined a couple forums because we were like, we don't know what we're doing. Maybe some people can share with us what it's like to be a landlord and share some lease agreements and what should we be thinking about. And the things that people would say on these forums was mind-blowing to me. Like, Jahmad, I understand that you are probably a person of color based off of your name. I want you to know that I don't mean this any way, shape, or form in a racist idea, but to protect your investment, I would not rent to someone who is a person of color. Not because they're bad tenants, Jahmad, but because you must understand that systemic racism still plays out and we're in the midst of a pandemic. Therefore, when you think about the fact that we're probably going to have another lockdown and there's going to be more layoffs, we know that systemically people of color are probably going to be disproportionately impacted by that. And you need to protect your investment. So if I was you, I wouldn't rent to people of color, again, not because they're bad tenants, but because based off of how society works, they're probably not going to be able to continue paying their rent. Oh, by the way, make sure that you don't rent to anyone who's not married. Because again, if they split up, you're on the hook. And all of these things, I just went, wow. Though we have all of these laws in place, it's truly nothing. And when you're talking about the individual side that protects someone, right? Because I could make up a bunch of excuses. So again, this all plays out. So how do we become anti-racist is extremely important. Here's a quick tip, and then I'm going to be quiet, Alberto, because I see the time. And that is this. We must intentionally start having conversations around race. We must also look at our policies, practices, and procedures. So even as we think about our communities and community design, as we think about even safety, what do we really mean by keeping our community safe? We must have explicit conversations around that, because it's like if I threw out, hey, let's all be respectful, and I asked who could agree with that, everyone would raise their hand. But please know this, we would have 25 different definitions of what respect looks like on this call. And so even when we talk about keeping our communities safe, we must be explicit in what does that mean and what does that look like, right? And it's so interesting because at one point in time, communities were trying to keep themselves safe from Black people. I love the fact that the conversation is changing to saying, how do we keep Black people safe in our communities? And not just Black people, we're talking about race tonight, but other people as well, right? So, that's a part of the conversation. Because again, how we've been raised, how we've been conditioned to look at these things, it will shape our actions. And so if we have been conditioned that this is what it looks like. The last thing that I'm sharing with you, not right now, but you're going to get in the email, is a list of what's called characteristics of white supremacy culture. Very loaded term, but hear me out on this. And one of them talks about the confusion between discomfort and threat to safety, and how often people of color are victims of someone else mistaking their discomfort as a threat to their safety. Because I don't like the fact that they're playing music loud next door. That's discomfort, but I can pick up the phone and feel like my safety is being threatened. Because when I confronted my neighbors about the party, I didn't like the way that they responded and they were too aggressive. And therefore I feel like my safety is being threatened, even though I'm the one who stepped on their property, knocked on their door and shouted at them to turn down that music. When they told me to shut up and mind my own business, that didn't feel good to me. And now I'm calling the cops and saying there's a group of aggressive people next door and they're playing music and blah, 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 blah. And I feel threatened. And now that puts their life at risk. So how we see these things is extremely important. And if we truly want to create safe communities, this must be a part of the conversation, in my opinion. So I know I gave you a lot in a very short amount of time to think about. But I appreciate you again for having me. Alberto, I'll send you all of those resources that I just discussed for you to send out to the group. But I thank you all for your time. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to share this space with you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jahmad. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. So in the interest of just since of time here, we're going to go ahead and jump on over to our next presenter. From the Housing Justice Project tonight, we have Kasey Burton joining us to share a little bit about some resources for housing as well as housing discrimination. So please go right ahead, and we will have a little bit of time afterwards to take some questions as well, if you have them. So if you have those, please save them to the end.
Okay, and you got the PowerPoint, right? Also, nobody told me that I was gonna have to follow this amazing speaker. So that seems a little unfair. But thank you, Jahmad, because even though I can't compete, I feel like I learned so much, and it's so important to be having these conversations. And I would like to note that we do see a lot of the things that you discussed, and it's really frustrating because the law can be so limited in what it can accomplish. We have people come to us and they say, I'm dealing with X, Y, and Z. There's no statute that can directly address that issue. And it doesn't feel good to have to be the person to tell someone that. And it's just so important that people are continuing to work towards developing laws, and not just the law, but changing the culture, because that can also lead to changes in the laws. I also wanted to note a lot of the suggestions, Jamal, that you received in your forums, super illegal. And feel free to reach out to us to have your lease reviewed if you are looking to sign a lease, and then we can let you know, okay, well, this isn't allowed, because we see leases all the time that have provisions in them that they just shouldn't. Sometimes people just get form leases from different jurisdictions off of the internet, and they don't know that some of the things that they're having you sign, just they can't have. And we also would want to have a conversation with that landlord about why it's structured the way it is. So that's something that we would definitely want to help with. Okay, so, am I doing Alberto, am I doing the PowerPoint, or are you doing the PowerPoint?
I'm doing it here. I have it
perfect.
all ready to go.
Oh man, this circle. We've tried to remove it 3 times from this presentation and it keeps coming back, and I don't know why.
Well, the people, the same people putting this on. Think about Sage Street.
All right, here we go. So obviously one major issue that people are dealing with right now, the moratorium. It's got a lot of different provisions. It can feel really long, and it's not written in a particularly accessible manner, which is a little frustrating. And it seems like maybe some of the provisions don't go far enough or are not clear enough. But ultimately it was extended to December 31st. Some people say it's not going to be extended past that. Other people do. I personally think that there's a pretty solid chance that it's going to be extended. And it requires an affidavit if your landlord gives you a notice to sell or that they intend to occupy. It also talks about landlord-tenant communication, because some landlords have wanted to work with people for payment plans, and they feel like they can't talk to them. It also talks about rent increases, and those are pretty specific. And again, if you have any questions, we're here. So one issue, well, a number of issues that we're having. So those 60-day notices to either occupy the premises as your primary residence or to sell the property, we are noticing that those notices are sometimes being used as pretext in a variety of ways. So either you haven't paid rent and your landlord says, well, I'm just going to move in, and they think that they can move forward with that, and that's all the proof they have to provide. We've definitely been challenging that, and it's unfortunate because that pretext covers a pretty broad array of motives, unfortunately, that people are using it to get people out. People are having a really hard time finding housing right now. There's just simply not enough housing, and that's causing a real problem because people who are willing to leave when their landlord asks them have literally nowhere to go. It's been tough to get people to work on payment plans, because I don't know if you all are aware, but in the moratorium, you can discuss a payment plan with your landlord, and that is something that can help you get back on track with them, and we're happy to help with that negotiation. That'll come up later. And it's also really frustrating, especially because of the federal funds. It's just, there's not enough time to use all the funds, and people still need help, and cutoffs keep coming and going, and it's just not working out as smoothly, and there's not as much help as a lot of us were hoping there would be. So one program that I want to talk to you about is Free 253. It's a collaboration between Tacoma Pro Bono, where I'm a staff attorney in the Housing Justice Project, the Center for Dialogue and Resolution, and they help with mediations, and Fair Housing. And I'm sure you, well, it's possible you are not familiar with Fair Housing, but they handle a lot of discrimination cases that come up. And it provides a free platform for you to meet with your landlord and negotiate issues with them. So you try to negotiate a payment plan because you're behind on rent with your landlord, and your landlord says, I am absolutely convinced that you can pay more than that. You're stiffing me. That's when you would definitely want to sit down with a mediator who would work with both parties to come up with something that works for everybody. So it's not a matter of you walk in there and the landlord gets what they want. An important part of this is walking into this mediation session and you have a voice, and you're absolutely encouraged to use that voice. And we really want people to reach out and try to use this, because once the moratorium expires, we're going to have this whole flood of issues regarding failure to pay rent. And there is a rule in Washington State where you do, well, in Pierce County specifically, that you have to do some sort of mediation before moving forward with your case. So it's going to be required one way or the other, and it's better to get it out of the way sooner rather than later. So we do ask that people reach out to us. We're happy to get you going, and hopefully get you on a path where you feel like you're in a fair situation. And for Tacoma Pro Bono, we actually have a broad array of services. So we are a part of Free 253, which is a really helpful program. We also provide a lot of free civil legal aid. So we've got family law help that we do. We have our Native American Legal Aid Program. We have the Housing Justice Project, the Domestic Violence Survivor Advocacy Project. And we also have a number of clinics that are not filling up as much as, well, frankly, they used to in the pre-COVID times. So we want to encourage people to reach out and get the help that they need. And what we're doing in response to the moratorium and the pandemic, we've been working at Tacoma Pro Bono to expand our resources, to expand our community outreach. And if any of you feel like we aren't reaching out to people that we need to, or you want us to talk to your organization, or you have somebody in mind that you'd like to have us talk to, we are so open to that. And we would love to be involved, because ultimately our goal is to serve the community. Free 253 is also working on a program to help eliminate barriers to housing. So unfortunately, if you have an eviction on your record, that can make it really, really hard to get a house, especially, and there's a really terrible outcome where people of color are actually pursued for evictions much more than white people. It's unfortunately how the system's been working for quite some time. And we want to try to do what's called a limited dissemination. An order of limited dissemination is something that the court issues, and it basically says no tenant screening companies can now let landlords know when you're applying to their property that you have an eviction on your record. And there are a number of requirements that go with that. But if you have an eviction on your record, reach out to us because we want to try to eliminate these barriers as much as possible. So I also wanted to touch on some suggestions for handling landlord-tenant issues. You want to make sure that you try to keep all of your documents in one place, have a little file folder, or maybe you throw them all in the same drawer. That's fine as long as they're all together. And that way, if you need to, you can go back and you have a paper trail. You want to make sure you're getting receipts or some sort of payment confirmation for your rent, especially right now with the way things are going with rental difficulties. And you want to try to document as much as possible. So you're having an issue with your landlord. You write down that you contacted them, you sent them an email, you called them, whatever, and then you don't hear from them and you call them again. Okay, so you would want to write down the fact that you did that second call, because when you come to us, that makes it so much easier for us to point out, hey, you're doing all of these things wrong, and here's what needs to change. And on that note, try to communicate with your landlord in writing if possible, because that, again, really establishes a strong paper trail that we can look back on and use as evidence if your landlord's trying to do something a little hinky. Oh, that slide's loading weird. Ah, there we go. So on tacomaprobono.org, we've got an intake form. You click it and you fill it out, and that gets you started on services. You can also email us at the Housing Justice Project, and that will get you started. We've got the phone number. Basically, you do one intake and we can guide you wherever you need to go. We want to make sure that we are meeting the emergent needs of the community. And if you want to reach out to us and you feel like maybe we're missing something, we want to hear that too. So I just want to make sure that everybody's aware of some of the resources that are out there. Tacoma Pro Bono, Free 253. We're here to help. So please reach out to us. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
No? Okay.
Do you know of any resources like for, I know one of the things that is coming up, the Black Lives Matters movement, is about making it possible for people, especially of color, to own a home.
Mm-hmm.
So do you know of any resources where people can go to see the possibility of becoming a homeowner?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, maybe it could be their credit score or something, but, you know, they're living in the place and they're paying just as much as they would for a house.
It's basically a mortgage. That's what rent is these days. It's higher than a mortgage in a lot of cases.
So, but they just can't, you know, that credit score is preventing them from getting into a home. Or anyway, is there any type of organization out there that can maybe advise people?
There's one organization that comes to mind, and it's called COBI, and it is an organization that we recently came into contact with, where you can buy a house with a friend, sibling, a family member, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever, and they help walk you through the process. A good first step would be to your bank, just to see what sort of options are available. And we are in the process of developing some financial education classes to help people figure out how to repair their scores, to build up their credit, and to make sure that they can provide an accurate representation of who they are with their score, versus the way credit scores now are kind of a little bit arbitrary sometimes, it seems like. if you email me, I can get a list together. I didn't have that prepared, but I'd be happy to work on that with you.
I'm
I'll
sure
put my email.
there's a need out there. There's a lot of people in situations like that, especially people of color, and, can't be homeowners because of the struggles they've gone through. And so,
oh, that didn't go to everyone. That just went to one person. Okay. Yeah, so here's my email, Kasey@tacomaprobono.org. If you're looking for resources, I will either send you the right person or I'll look it up and we'll make sure that you have the information that you need.
okay, thank you, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Anyone else have any questions for Kasey?
Yeah, I had a question. Is there a place that a landlord could go to get? I mean, is there like a standard rental form that they can use that would pass muster? As far as getting through, not having any legal challenges because it's pretty much open in there. I mean, it's a form that
that does not discriminate.
Basically.
Yeah, so we don't have that available, but if you reach out to me, I can put you in touch with a landlord association we do a lot of work with, and they would probably have that information for you.
Okay, all right.
This is Pat. I would urge you to be very cautious when you're talking about lease agreements and et cetera. And if you're new at this, I would actually go talk to a housing attorney. There are systemic problems right down from the state of Washington requires you to hold your deposits in a trust account. Well, I'll bet not one of you can actually define what a trust account is. And
okay, yes. And we do have a landlord guide on our website on the HJP page, and that walks you through what landlord tenant law looks like in normal times.
Yeah, when you talk about landlord tenant, it's one thing to have, if I have a 20-unit apartment building, okay, that's a certain relationship I have with my tenants. Personally, I have a little duplex. I live in one side, I have one tenant, okay? That's a whole different relationship. I have a neighbor. I have a neighbor down the street who's renting out 2 rooms so she can keep her house. That's an entirely different relationship as well. And I'm not suggesting that the laws should be different for any of those 3. But it needs to quit making the landlords the bad guys here. And that is happening more and more and more. And that's one of the things I kind of resent. I still don't like the 27 pages of disclosures I have to give to a new tenant, along with telling them where they got to go to register to vote to be legal. I don't know that that's my responsibility or should be. So,
well,
anyway,
I think it's definitely trying to get landlords involved in civic engagement and trying to encourage people to be involved as far as the disclosures. There are always so many organizations trying to work on changing the laws, refining them, creating new ones. And if that's something that you're interested in, you can email me. And I know that the Landlord Association that I mentioned previously also does work on that kind of stuff. And we do have good relationships with a lot of landlords. I do want to say that not all landlords are bad guys. A lot of people want to do right. They just don't know what they're doing sometimes. So it may be a situation where your landlord doesn't know what they're doing and then don't necessarily mean to do what they're doing, but it is important that that is corrected.
Could I say one more thing real quick? And this is to Maureen, who talked about where you go to get qualified and what do you do to fix things. I'm glad you said go to your bank, because every bank that makes mortgage loans, when they make a loan to a first-time buyer, they've got to send them to a class. You got to go through the class, and you can go through the class without being a buyer. And the bank will tell you what to do, and they will walk you through all of the things that you need to do to be a qualified home buyer. And pick a bank. I mean, it's any of them. They all have access to that. So and that comes from 40 years in the banking business. So
thank you.
Anyway, that's all.
So again, I'll just do the plug of, you got a problem with your landlord, call us. We're there. We want to help. Put us to work for you, because that's what we want to do.
All right. Thank you so much, Kasey, for joining us tonight and for sharing all that good information. If anyone has any questions about anything that was presented tonight, Kasey's put her email in the chat there, or you can reach me as well, and I can also reach out to Kasey. Well, thank you so much to everyone for joining us tonight. There was a lot to think about after all that was shared with us. But we really appreciate you joining us and coming out this evening. And we hope that it was a very informative and very helpful bit of information here. And if you have any questions again about anything, please don't hesitate to let me know. I'll be sharing out the materials that Jahmad sends me. I'll go ahead and send them out to everyone that is in attendance tonight here. And aside from that, I hope you have a wonderful evening and a great holiday season as well.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto.
Thank you, Alberto.
All right, good night, everyone.